She took the oath, not for applause, but for truth. Karoline Leavitt wasn't on trial, but it sure felt like she was. When a federal analyst bent the facts in open court, Karoline did what any honest American would do. She corrected it. But in Judge Douglas Whitaker's courtroom, truth wasn't welcome. In less than 30 seconds, the gavel came down, and so did the cuffs. The room gasped. The cameras clicked. The system had just arrested a woman for refusing to lie. And then, from the back row, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett stood up, holding a document that would turn the entire courtroom on its head. This isn't just a story about power. It's about what happens when someone finally says, enough. If you believe in standing up for truth, tap that like button, subscribe, and comment below. Would you have spoken up in Karoline's place? Because after you see what happened next, silence won't be an option. The morning began like any other in downtown Richmond. A pale sun crept across the courthouse facade, casting long shadows down the marble steps of the Eastern District. The building, wrapped in gray stone and cold precision, didn't hint at what was about to happen inside. To most passersby, it was just another day in a town where bureaucracy hummed louder than outrage. But to those paying closer attention, those who knew what case Vardyar 2487 meant, this Tuesday would not be ordinary. Courtroom 3A was full by 9:30 a.m. Not packed with spectators, but with insiders, reporters, aides, legal clerks, and federal officials who could sense when something bigger than a procedural hearing was about to unfold. Some were here for gossip, others for political ammunition. A few just wanted to see if the rumors were true. Karoline Leavitt sat at the defense table in a navy blue blazer, her posture straight, but her expression unreadable. Only 31, but her composure suggested someone who had weathered far more than her years should have allowed. Her hands rested still, folded atop a leather portfolio she'd brought herself. No entourage, no fanfare, just her and her evidence, and the steel-cord sense of duty she carried like a second skin. Across the aisle, Judge Douglas Whitaker presided with the same reputation he had built over decades, iron-fisted, proud, and unyielding. His eyes rarely met the defendants. He looked down from the bench, like a man who had stopped believing the people in front of him could ever be his equal. And when he did glance toward Karoline, it wasn't with curiosity, it was with calculation. Jasmine Crockett, sitting quietly 3 rows back on the right side of the gallery, didn't move when the judge entered. She had her reasons. The red blazer she wore was deliberate, sharp, commanding, feminine, without apology. But her stillness? That was strategy. She wasn't there to perform, not yet. She watched Karoline carefully, noting the quiet resolve in the young woman's face. Jasmine had known that look before. It was the look of someone who was walking into a fight, knowing the system wouldn't fight fair. The first hour of proceedings was stiff, procedural. Karoline answered questions calmly, always referencing dates, reports, and memos. Her voice never shook, even when pressed. It wasn't passion that defined her testimony, it was precision. She spoke like someone who had double-checked every sentence. But then, just after 10 a.m., came the moment that broke the spell. An analyst from the federal agency testifying under oath misstated job loss projections in relation to a proposed policy Karoline had critiqued in public. It was subtle, a number skewed too low, a timeline conveniently shifted. Karoline interrupted. Not rudely, not recklessly, but with certainty. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, her voice clear. Judge Whitaker frowned. "You may not," he snapped. "You'll speak when spoken to." Karoline looked forward, calm. "Then please ask him to revise the data, because it's wrong." The room went still. The analyst shifted. The courtroom reporter stopped typing. Whitaker's voice dropped an octave. "Ms. Leavitt, this courtroom is not your press room." "And my oath isn't a press release," she replied. "If I let that lie stand, I'm part of it." That did it. Whitaker leaned forward, his eyes hard. "One more disruption, and I will hold you in contempt." Karoline blinked once, slow. Then she said what no one expected. "Then you better prepare your order, because the truth isn't leaving this room quietly." Gasps, audible, unplanned. Even Jasmine raised an eyebrow. It wasn't just the words, it was the way Karoline said them, without heat, without panic, like someone who knew what the stakes were and had made peace with the cost. In that moment, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, arms folded. Her eyes met Karoline's just once, and Karoline finally looked back. It was the first direct connection between them. Not as politicians, as women who understood exactly what it meant to be punished for telling the truth. Because Jasmine had lived this before. She had been underestimated, labeled, dismissed. And in Karoline's voice, she heard echoes of her own. What she didn't know, what no one knew yet, was that this wouldn't just be Karoline's battle. It would soon become Jasmine's too. And together, they were about to confront the kind of power that counted on women like them to break quietly. The gavel came down like a guillotine. Judge Whitaker didn't pause, didn't blink. His voice cut through the silence like a blade. Ms. Leavitt, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, take her into custody. The room inhaled as one. Gasps rose in waves, a shuffle of papers, the soft clack of pens hitting benches. One reporter muttered, "Oh my God," while another fumbled to steady his recorder. But in the center of it all, Karoline didn't move, not right away. She just stared forward, her eyes not wide with panic, but narrowing with something quieter. He was really doing it. He was putting her in handcuffs for correcting a lie under oath, for honoring the truth. The bailiff, a graying man who clearly hadn't expected this duty today, approached slowly. "Ma'am," he said, his voice low, almost apologetic. "Please stand." Karoline pushed back her chair. Her motions were steady, each one a deliberate act of defiance wrapped in grace. She adjusted her blazer, smoothed her skirt. She turned toward the judge with a gaze that didn't ask for mercy, only acknowledgement. "This isn't justice," she said, her voice firm but low. "It's theater." The cuffs clicked, a sound so small it should have gone unnoticed, but it echoed, not just through the courtroom, but through every conscience paying attention, through the journalists who had come for spectacle and were now witnesses to something unholy. Jasmine Crockett's jaw clenched. Her hand, still gripping her pen, stopped mid-sentence. She watched as Karoline turned, wrists now bound behind her back, and took her first steps toward the side door. She moved with grace, not arrogance, a slow walk, unflinching, like a woman who knew this moment would outlive everyone in that courtroom. The silence was oppressive, but Jasmine stood, not loudly, not dramatically. She rose like someone stepping into a role she had prepared her entire life to play. "That's enough, Your Honor," she said. The judge looked up, startled by the clarity of her voice. "You're out of line," she continued, pulling a document from her folder, "and I have proof." Whitaker frowned. "You are not counsel in this matter, Congresswoman." Jasmine walked forward. Her heels echoed like punctuation marks across the polished floor. She didn't raise her voice, but the silence in the courtroom bowed to her presence. "I am now, emergency motion filed under Rule 17B. Filed at 9:43 a.m. this morning. Federal stay order. This contempt ruling violates process." She placed the document on the clerk's desk. The red ink across the top practically screamed, "Received." A murmur broke through the gallery. The clerk looked to Whitaker, unsure. He hesitated. For the first time all morning, his confidence cracked. "We will recess for 10 minutes, he said, slamming the gavel again. But it didn't sound like control this time. It sounded like retreat. Karoline turned slowly toward Jasmine. Their eyes met again. And for the second time that day, something passed between them. Not words, not strategy, recognition. "You didn't let me fall." And Jasmine nodded, just once. "You weren't going to fall." As the judge stepped out, as the murmurs rose, as the journalists jostled for position, Jasmine walked to Karoline's side. The bailiff, still unsure, stood with the keys in his hand. "Unlock her," Jasmine said, calm as scripture. The bailiff looked at the clerk, then the judge's empty bench. Then slowly, he nodded. The cuffs were removed. Karoline rubbed her wrists gently and smiled, not because she had won, but because she hadn't bent, and because Jasmine Crockett had just reminded everyone in that room, truth may get silenced, but it never gets cuffed without someone noticing. The courtroom buzzed with a cautious kind of energy when the judge exited. Not the loud type, not panic, not chatter, but the kind of static that sits in the air after lightning. The shock had landed. Now came the silence of consequences. Jasmine didn't speak again. She just stood beside Karoline, hands folded calmly in front of her, while aides and press quietly scrambled behind them. Cameras weren't allowed, but that hadn't stopped a dozen blurry stills of Karoline in handcuffs from hitting social media within 5 minutes. Upstairs, a clerk printed copies of the emergency stay order. Downstairs, Whitaker sat in his chambers, red-faced and pacing. And in a side conference room on the second floor, Karoline and Jasmine sat in silence. Karoline, still smoothing the lines of her blazer. Jasmine, flipping through a second folder with calm, deliberate movements. The moment was thick with restraint. Then Karoline finally spoke. "I didn't think he'd actually do it," she said. Jasmine looked up. "He didn't think you'd call his bluff." Karoline gave a faint, tired smile. "So he turned it into punishment." Jasmine nodded. Power punishes presence, especially when it comes from someone who's not supposed to stand that tall. Karoline turned her wrists slightly, as if feeling the phantom weight of the cuffs. "You didn't even hesitate." "Didn't need to. I've seen men like him try to build walls with words and wrap them in robes. But walls like that crack when the right truth hits them." Karoline exhaled, steady but subdued. "You knew the system would protect you." Jasmine set the folder down and looked her in the eye. "No, I knew it wouldn't protect him." They spent the next 30 minutes building what Jasmine called a procedural fortress. Not an emotional appeal, not a media tour. A fortress. Jasmine outlined the next steps in a crisp, measured tone. Submit a motion to attach the stay directly to the contempt ruling. Notify the Judicial Oversight Board of Whitaker's contempt abuse. Leak, just enough, to 3 reliable senior legal correspondents. Karoline watched her work, the way Jasmine sharpened her language like she was honing a blade. "You don't yell," Karoline observed quietly. Jasmine smiled. "I don't have to. People hear better when you whisper the thing they fear." By the time the judge returned to the courtroom, the energy had shifted. He walked differently, not with pride, but with posture, stiff, controlled, like someone trying to hold on to a narrative slipping through his fingers. He didn't acknowledge the press, didn't glance at Jasmine, barely looked at Karoline. Instead, he sat and spoke. "This court acknowledges receipt of the emergency motion and stay order, which will be reviewed as part of the formal proceeding." No apology, no reversal. But the tone, the brittle edge to it, said everything. He'd been caught, and the game had changed. Outside, the story was already changing. News anchors now used words like retaliatory, questionable, and judicial optics. And Karoline? She was no longer the headline. Jasmine Crockett was. Clips of her standing up, documents in hand, were circulating like wildfire. TikToks, Instagram reels. A slow zoom on her face, calm and unbothered, captioned, "This is what real power looks like." Karoline saw them. She didn't repost. She didn't smile. She just closed the news app and looked at Jasmine. "You didn't do that for the cameras." "Cameras don't remember justice. People do." And Jasmine leaned in. "Now we move to phase 2. Which is?" Jasmine handed her a printed memo. It was addressed to the Federal Judicial Oversight Committee. Subject line, "Pattern of Procedural Misuse by Honier Douglas Whitaker." Karolina read in silence. When she looked up, Jasmine was already on her phone. 3 messages. 3 names. 3 journalists who didn't need a press release to know a story was real. Jasmine didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, Karoline Leavitt realized something. This wasn't just a courtroom anymore. It was a battlefield. And Jasmine Crockett had just handed her the sword. The war wasn't won in the courtroom. It never is. The real fight, the one that changes public opinion, reshapes perception, and pressures the system, happens in the corridors, back rooms, and inboxes no one ever sees. And that's exactly where Jasmine took Karoline. Not to the press podium, not to a morning news show, but to a private law office on the 12th floor of a nondescript building 2 blocks from the courthouse. No logos, no microphones. Just reinforced glass, a soundproof room, and a whiteboard already filled with timelines and case citations. "They'll try to paint you as emotional," Jasmine said as she pulled out a chair. As a grandstander, a disruptor. Karoline sat down, crossing one leg over the other. I didn't even raise my voice. They don't need volume, they just need a frame. Jasmine clicked on a projector. A muted clip from a morning talk show played. Well, she certainly didn't behave like a typical witness. Karoline looked away. Stop watching that, Jasmine said, pausing the clip. It's not real. It's a reaction. We're here to shape truth, not chase clicks. She pointed to the board. Here's what we do. There were 3 names listed at the top, journalists, all known for taking the long route to a story, all still respected by people who don't trust talking heads. Below the names, bullet points, verified timestamps, documentation chains, witness inconsistencies. A red asterisk next to Whitaker's ex parte comment. We don't fight this in one news cycle, Jasmine said. We flood them with facts. Dull, indisputable, boring facts. Karoline tilted her head. Is boring really going to cut through the noise? Only if you make it undeniable. She handed Karoline a mock press brief. 3 paragraphs, no adjectives, just proof. Karoline scanned it. You're not letting me say anything emotional. Nope, because the emotion isn't yours to express. It's theirs to feel. There was a silence, not awkward, just focused. Jasmine stepped closer to the window, overlooking the courthouse below. They're expecting a show, she said. We give them a sequence. What does that mean? We drop the complaint Monday, internal memo only. Tuesday, we release the witness transcript that contradicts the analyst. Wednesday, we let the video of the cuffing circulate again, but this time paired with the signed stay order that was already in place. Karoline nodded slowly. By Thursday, Jasmine said, turning back, they won't be debating if you were wrong. They'll be debating why the judge acted without reading the file. She smiled. And by Friday, we don't need to speak. The story will have spoken for us. By midweek, the machine had turned. What had begun as a smear campaign transformed into a timeline, a discrepancy, a question. Headlines cooled. Op-eds started asking if the judge had jumped the gun. And late Wednesday evening, a quietly worded editorial ran in a legacy paper. Due process matters most when we think someone doesn't deserve it. Karoline stared at it in her hotel room. That's not exactly a vindication, she muttered. No, Jasmine said, reading over her shoulder. But it's the start of one. Back in D.C., the Judicial Oversight Clerk received an envelope marked confidential. Inside, a report with footnotes, signed affidavits, and a detailed timeline of procedural breaches. On the cover, filed by Reperture's Jasmine Crockett. No press conference, no press at all, just paper and pressure. Karoline sat across from Jasmine the next morning, both sipping burnt office coffee. Do you think he knows? He knows, Jasmine replied. Think he cares? Jasmine leaned back. Men like him don't panic when they're exposed. They panic when they realize someone else is writing the story now. Karoline smiled faintly. And you brought a pen. I brought a highlighter. Outside the courthouse, a local camera crew tried to snag Karoline for a statement. She declined. The anchor turned to Jasmine. Congresswoman, any comment on the judicial complaint filed yesterday? She didn't flinch. No comment, she said. But keep watching. And she walked away. Sometimes the loudest move is the one that leaves them guessing. It was Friday morning when the tone inside the courthouse changed, not from anything spoken, but from something missing. The usual buzz of clerks and clerical banter was hushed. There was a stillness to the hallways, a cautious energy floating through every elevator ding and closed door. Courtroom 3A filled slowly, not with the curious, not with opportunists, but with those who had been watching all week, quietly. Reporters who now took notes with more care. Staffers who whispered less. Judges who walked in with smaller footsteps. Karoline sat at the defense table again. But this time, her hands didn't tremble. They didn't even flinch. Jasmine sat behind her, same red blazer, same unshaken poise. But now, the eyes in the room watched her differently, not with suspicion, but with caution, as if they had come to recognize something that couldn't be undone. The gavel cracked once, but it didn't command the room anymore. It only marked its presence. Judge Whitaker entered, robes impeccable, gaze forward. He settled into his chair slowly. "This court has reviewed all materials and motions associated with the emergency stay and contempt order," he said. "No commentary, no lecturing, just facts." Karolina watched him carefully, not to challenge, to understand. She saw the lines in his face, deeper than they were days ago, the stiffness in his spine, the subtle clench of his jaw before each sentence. He continued, "There is no sufficient basis for sanctions, punitive measures, or further procedural action against Ms. Leavitt." There was no gasp, just stillness, the kind that acknowledged a storm had passed through and left nothing standing in its place except the one who had refused to bend. Karoline bowed her head gently, not in submission, but in reverence to the moment and everything it had cost. Whitaker cleared his throat. "We now move to close proceedings." But Jasmine stood. "Your Honor, one matter of the record." He looked up, reluctant. "Ms. Crockett." The court's closing statement makes reference to emotional decorum and optics unbecoming of a witness. I would ask the court to strike these references from the record. He frowned. "They are not judicial findings, merely commentary." And commentary carries weight in headlines, sir. We'd ask it carry none here." There was a pause. Whitaker nodded, barely. "So noted." That was all Jasmine needed. She sat back down. Karoline smiled without turning. The courtroom adjourned, but no one left right away. Not out of confusion, out of recognition, that they had seen something they didn't know they were waiting for. Outside, reporters moved faster now, but not toward Karoline. They moved around her. They filmed her walking quietly down the steps, head high, shoulders back, her hands free. They didn't shout questions. They didn't demand answers. They watched, because now she was the story. Not for what was said about her, but for what she never stopped standing for. Jasmine joined her at the sidewalk. "So," Karoline said, adjusting her sleeve. "That's it?" "Not quite," Jasmine replied. She handed her a sealed envelope. Inside, a memo from the Judicial Oversight Committee. A review of procedural conduct has been initiated regarding Honoré Douglas Whitaker. Findings will be filed under federal standards of impartiality. Karoline looked up. "You didn't tell me you filed it." Jasmine shrugged. "Didn't need to. The filing wasn't about making noise. It was about reminding the system it still answers to the people." Karoline nodded. "And what happens next?" "We let the record speak." For some, they stood together in the rising sun, the courthouse casting a long shadow behind them. But for the first time, the shadow didn't reach their feet. That evening, in the quiet corner of a community hall 2 hours outside D.C., Karoline Leavitt stood at a podium with no cameras and no crew, just people, veterans, grandmothers, factory workers, high schoolers with notebooks. She didn't start with victory. She started with humility. "I was silenced briefly, not by law, but by fear, wrapped in process." She paused. "But someone stood up for me, not with slogans, not with spectacle, with proof." She glanced toward the back, where Jasmine sat beside a woman in a denim jacket, arms folded, nodding slowly. "And now," Karoline continued, "it's my turn to stand for someone else." Applause rose, not thunderous, but deep, rooted, because in that room, and in millions like it across the country, there were people who had almost given up on truth, until they saw what it looked like when it stood its ground, when it walked out of a courtroom, unbowed. If this story moved you, don't stay silent. Let truth echo further. Like this video, share your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe for more stories that show what justice really looks like, quiet, grounded, and powerful. Because truth doesn't scream, it stands. And thanks to Jasmine Crockett, it walked free.